You are listening to Ecom Expedition with Asim, Paid Media Intelligence Series. I'm Erica. We've spent the last few episodes unpacking the infrastructure behind paid media, and now we move into platforms, starting with Google Search, which almost every e-commerce brand is using, but very few are actually using with intent, what makes it different, how the auction really works, and where the real inefficiencies tend to creep in. Asim, let's start there.
Yeah, that's a good place to begin because the difference sounds simple when you say it out loud, but it's one of those things that changes how you interpret everything else that follows. Every other channel we're going to talk about in this series is interruption driven, meaning you're placing something in front of someone who wasn't actively looking for it and hoping the message is strong enough to make them stop and pay attention. Search doesn't behave like that. It shows up when someone is already looking, already comparing, already trying to solve something, and that shift in context changes the commercial dynamics quite a bit.
And the way I usually frame that for founders is, other channels are trying to create demand or at least capture attention in a noisy environment, whereas search is stepping into demand that already exists. The person has already decided they want something in that category, they're just figuring out who to buy it from.
Yeah, that's a clean way to put it, and once you look at it that way, the numbers start to make more sense, because a click from search is coming from someone further along in their own decision process, so naturally the conversion rate is higher, but at the same time, that click costs more. And this is where people get tripped up, because they compare the cost without adjusting for intent.
Right, they look at Google versus Meta, see the higher CPC, and assume something is off.
Exactly. And it's a very tempting conclusion to reach, because the math looks better in the short term. If you move budget to cheaper clicks, your cost per click drops, traffic increases, and depending on how you're measuring, it can even look like performance is holding steady for a while. But underneath that, what you've actually done is swap higher intent demand for lower intent exposure. And that difference doesn't show up immediately, it shows up later in behavior.
And that's the part that's harder to connect back.
Definitely, because you start seeing it in things like weaker conversion rates, less consistent add-to-cart behavior, sometimes more returns, and over time a noticeable difference in repeat purchase patterns. And unless you're actively looking at that downstream data, it's easy to miss what caused it.
So in a way, the cheaper click ends up costing more, just not in a way that's obvious in the dashboard.
That's right, and this is why, broadly speaking, search tends to bring in stronger customers. Not in every category, there are always exceptions, but consistently enough that you should be evaluating it through a slightly different lens, not just cost efficiency, but customer quality over time.
Let's talk about the auction, because I think most people have a rough understanding, but not enough depth to actually use it strategically.
Yeah, most people think of it as a straight bidding contest, whoever pays more wins, and that's not really how it works. The auction is happening every time someone types a query, and it's happening in milliseconds. But the outcome is based on something Google calls ad rank, which blends your bid with your quality score. And that second part is where things get interesting.
Because quality score is doing more work than people assume.
It is, and it's intentional. Google needed a way to keep the search experience useful, because if ads were purely based on who paid the most, you'd end up with irrelevant results, fewer clicks, and over time a worse product. So quality score acts as a filter. It looks at how well your ad matches the query, how likely it is to be clicked, and whether your landing page actually delivers on what the ad promises.
So relevance isn't just a nice to have, it directly affects cost and position.
Exactly, and this is where the leverage comes in, because a brand that aligns those elements properly, the keyword, the ad copy, the landing page, can outperform someone with a higher bid and often pay less per click while doing it, which is not how most people think about competition in search.
Most still treat it like a budget game.
They do, and that's where they leave efficiency on the table, because there are advertisers in most categories who are quietly focused on alignment, tightening the connection between intent and message, and that gives them an advantage that isn't purely financial, it's structural.
I want to come back to the budget shift question, because this is where founders tend to make big decisions. When does it actually make sense to move budget away from search?
The first thing I look at is how the category behaves. Are people actively searching for this type of product when they're ready to buy? Because if they are, search is naturally going to be a high-value channel even if it's more expensive. But if the category doesn't have that behavior, which happens with newer or less defined products, then search becomes less efficient, and you need other channels to create that initial awareness.
So it really comes down to how the customer discovers the product.
Exactly. And then the second layer is what happens after the click, which is where most brands don't go deep enough. If your search-acquired customers are spending more, returning less, or coming back more frequently, then the higher acquisition cost is often justified. but that only becomes visible when you look beyond campaign-level metrics.
Which means doing some level of cohort analysis.
Yes, even a simple version of it can be enough to change your perspective. Just comparing how customers behave over time based on where they came from can reveal patterns that aren't obvious in platform dashboards, and I've seen cases where search customers were significantly more valuable over their lifetime, which completely shifts how you think about allocation.
So the mistake is stopping at acquisition cost instead of looking at acquisition quality.
That's exactly it. Cost is easy to see, quality takes a bit more effort, but once you have that view, the conversation becomes much more grounded in reality.
What else are brands getting wrong inside search accounts themselves?
One of the bigger ones is match type management, and it tends to drift over time, either becoming too broad, where you're picking up queries that don't really relate to your product, or too narrow, where you're missing relevant demand, and maintaining that balance requires ongoing attention because search behavior isn't static.
So even a well-set-up account can degrade if it's left alone.
Exactly. And the other issue I see quite often is a disconnect between the ad and the landing page, where the ad is very specific in what it promises, but the landing page is more generic. And that gap affects conversion rate immediately, but it also feeds back into the auction through quality score. So you end up paying more while converting less, which is a difficult combination to recover from without fixing the underlying alignment.
Before we wrap, where does Performance Max actually sit alongside search right now?
It definitely has a role, but it works best as a supporting layer rather than the foundation. Most well-managed accounts still rely on standard shopping for control and visibility on core products, and then use Performance Max to extend reach into areas that search alone won't cover, like YouTube and display.
So it's more of an expansion layer.
That's a good way to think about it, and in practice, a lot of experienced operators are running a split that leans heavily towards standard shopping, with Performance Max taking a smaller share, which is quite different from how it's often positioned by platform reps.
Which brings us back to understanding incentives.
Exactly. Not to dismiss the recommendations, but to understand the context they're coming from, because once you see that clearly, you can make decisions that actually align with your business rather than just following default setups.
That's episode 4, Google Search, what makes it different, how the auction works, and where most e-commerce brands are losing efficiency. If you want to actually build the kind of analysis we talked about, that's exactly the kind of work that happens in a strategy session at ecomexpedition.com. Next episode, we go deeper into Performance Max and then into Meta. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Until next time.